The dusty road leading into the Navajo village seemed longer than Kai remembered. The red cliffs stood like silent sentinels, their faces etched by centuries of wind, rain, and history. The dry and biting air carried a strange stillness that Kai hadn't felt in years. The last time he had driven down this road was almost a decade ago, eager to leave behind the suffocating traditions, the endless stories of spirits, and the weight of a past that wasn't his to carry. At least, that's what he had thought back then. Now, he was back. The funeral was over. His father was buried in the sacred cemetery beneath the cottonwoods, their twisted branches whispering ancient songs in the wind. Kai hadn't shed a tear. Not because he didn't feel grief, but because the years apart had built a wall between him and everything his father represented. And yet, here he was, with a car full of his father's belongings, returning to the house he had sworn never to see again. The house that now seemed to hold secrets he was not prepared to face. The village seemed smaller and quieter. Houses were more run down than he remembered, their adobe walls weathered and cracked, the once vibrant colors now faded. The people who used to fill the dusty streets were now just shadows behind curtains, watching his arrival with wary eyes. Kai had barely stepped out of the car when an old man approached, Uncle Bege, one of the village elders. His face, lined with age and wisdom, showed little emotion as he greeted Kai with a curt nod. "It's good you came," Uncle Bege said, his voice rough like the land. "Your father spoke of you often." Kai forced a smile. "I wish I had made it back sooner." Uncle Bege didn't reply, but his eyes said enough. The silence between them was thick with words that neither wanted to speak. Before Kai could dwell on it, the elder shifted his gaze toward the distant mountains. "Strange things have been happening here. Your father, he was trying to protect us. You'll see." Without another word, Uncle Bege turned and walked away, his cane tapping softly against the dirt. Kai stood there, a hollow feeling in his chest. He had heard whispers at the funeral, talk of disappearances, animals found dead, mutilated in ways that defied explanation. And now, his father was dead too, though the official story said it was a heart attack. Still, something felt wrong, a lingering unease that hung in the air as if the land was warning him. The mystery of his father's death and the strange occurrences in the village added to the growing sense of unease. Shaking off the tension, Kai grabbed a few boxes from the car and walked up to the house. The door creaked open, revealing a home frozen in time. His father's things were just as they had been, neat and orderly, but the space felt colder, emptier. The air was heavy with a sense of foreboding, as if the house itself was warning him to leave. Kai set the boxes down on the kitchen table and deeply breathed. He wandered through the house, each room bringing memories flooding back. The kitchen where his mother used to cook, the living room where his father would sit, staring into the fire, telling stories about Navajo spirits and monsters, stories Kai had dismissed as nonsense. But now, those stories seemed to echo in his mind louder than ever. Finally, he went to his father's study, the one room he had always been forbidden to enter. The door was slightly ajar, as if waiting for him. The room was filled with books, papers, and an old, worn-out desk. Kai stepped in cautiously, his eyes drawn to a prominent leather-bound journal in the middle of the desk. He picked it up, flipping through its pages. The entries were cryptic, full of references to Navajo legends, strange symbols, and accounts of rituals. But what caught Kai's attention were the more recent entries. His father had been researching something dark. One word kept appearing over and over: Skinwalker. Kai frowned. Skinwalkers were just myths, stories told to scare children into behaving. But the deeper he read, the more unsettling it became. His father had been convinced that a skinwalker was responsible for the strange occurrences in the village. There were notes on animals found torn apart, strange footprints leading nowhere, and even mentions of people disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Kai's pulse quickened as he read his father's final entry. "I fear the skinwalker is close. It watches me now, waiting. I've seen its eyes in the darkness. I pray my son will come home before it's too late." A chill ran down Kai's spine. His father had genuinely believed in this, whatever it was. And now, Kai couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched too. The sense of dread was palpable, making Kai's fear more relatable to the readers. The sound of something scraping against the windowpane startled him. Kai whipped around, heart racing, but there was nothing outside, just the empty yard and the fading light of the desert. He laughed nervously, shaking his head. He was letting his father's paranoia get to him. The feeling of being watched intensified, making Kai's paranoia more relatable to the readers. But as he turned back to the journal, his gaze caught something out of the corner of his eye, a fleeting shadow shifting along the edge of the room. His breath caught in his throat. The sun had fully set now, casting the room into darkness. Kai slowly stepped back, his mind racing. Was it just his imagination, or was something lurking just beyond the edge of his vision? His father's words rang in his head again, louder this time. Before it's too late. Kai didn't want to believe it, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. The past he had left behind wasn't just a collection of old stories. It was real, and it was waiting for him. As the night deepened, Kai couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Not anymore. The morning sun barely pierced through the thick, heavy curtains of Kai's father's house, casting long shadows across the cluttered room. Kai hadn't slept well, and the night had been filled with unsettling dreams, flashes of dark, shifting figures and eerie whispers in a language he didn't understand. He woke up with the same cold sense of dread that had gripped him the moment he'd read his father's journal. Rubbing his eyes, Kai sat up, glancing at the desk where the leather-bound journal lay. It had to be a coincidence, he told himself. His father had always been obsessed with old legends and folklore, believing in things that didn't belong in the modern world. But something about the words he'd read last night kept gnawing at him. Why had his father been so convinced that a skinwalker was stalking the village? And why had he written about seeing the creature in the days before his death, adding to the mystery? Kai needed answers. He needed to understand what had driven his father into this madness. After making himself a cup of coffee, he returned to the study. The room was just as cluttered as the rest of the house, filled with dusty books, old photographs, and scattered papers. The shelves were lined with Navajo history books, ancient tomes on tribal lore, and personal notebooks. The place felt like a shrine to his father's obsession with the past. Kai sat at the desk and opened the journal again. The pages crinkled under his fingers, their contents written in his father's neat, careful handwriting. Some entries were mundane, detailing daily village life, but others spoke of strange occurrences. November 2nd. I saw it again. The figure in the distance, watching from the ridge. I know it's real. The same feeling of dread as before, the eyes burning through the dark. It's waiting. Kai's skin prickled as he read the words. His father had believed that the skinwalker was real, that much was clear. But there had to be something more to this. His father wasn't one to fall for mere superstition. Flipping through more pages, Kai came across detailed notes about Navajo witchcraft. He read about rituals, forbidden practices, and ancient beliefs about people who could transform into animals by wearing their skins. The legend said that these skinwalkers were once human but had traded their humanity for dark power. Kai frowned as he traced his finger across an underlined passage. The curse is passed down through bloodlines. It cannot be undone by any ordinary means. Bloodlines? What did that have to do with his father's death? As Kai closed the journal, a knock at the door startled him. His heart raced as he stood, wondering if it was Uncle Bege again or perhaps another villager paying their respects. When he opened the door, it wasn't anyone he recognized. A tall, elderly woman stood on the porch, wrapped in a traditional Navajo shawl, her weathered face framed by silver-streaked hair. Her eyes were sharp, almost hawk-like, and they studied Kai with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You're your father's son, aren't you?" she asked, her voice raspy but strong. Kai nodded. "Yes, I'm Kai." The woman stepped closer, glancing past him into the house. "I'm Grandmother Naba. Your father, he was a good man. But he was caught up in something dangerous. Something he couldn't control." Kai felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "You knew my father?" "I did," she said, her gaze unwavering. "He came to me many times, asking for guidance, for help. But the path he was on was not one I could stop." Kai furrowed his brow. "What are you talking about? My father he wasn't involved in anything dangerous." Grandmother Naba's expression darkened. "He was involved in things beyond your understanding, boy. The skinwalker, it is real. And your father believed that he could stop it. But he was wrong." Kai felt a chill run through him. "You believe in the skinwalker too?" "Believe?" She chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "I've seen it. We all have, though most are too afraid to speak of it." Your father was brave, but he underestimated the power he was facing. He thought it was just a creature of myth, but it's much more than that. It's tied to your family, Kai. Kai blinked, confusion and disbelief washing over him. Tied to my family? How? Grandmother Naba sighed and gestured toward the house. May I come in? There's much you need to know. Reluctantly, Kai stepped aside and let her in. She moved slowly as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders and took a seat at the kitchen table. Kai sat across from her, his mind racing. You've read your father's journal, haven't you? She asked. Kai nodded. I don't understand it, though. He was talking about a family curse, something about bloodlines. Grandmother Naba leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. Many generations ago, one of your ancestors made a grave mistake. He was a powerful man who was respected among the tribe, but his hunger for power consumed him. He sought out forbidden rituals, hoping to gain control over the spirit world. But what he found was darker than anything he could have imagined. Kai's heart pounded in his chest as he listened, the room seeming to close in around him. He became a skinwalker, Grandmother Naba continued. And though he was defeated, the curse he unleashed didn't die with him. It lingered in your family, passed down from generation to generation. Each time, it grows stronger, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Kai swallowed hard. Are you saying that my father? She nodded solemnly. Your father knew the curse was coming for him. He tried to stop it. He thought he could find a way to end it before it claimed him, but in the end, it was too late. Kai sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. But that's impossible. Skinwalkers aren't real. They're just stories. They're very real, Kai, Grandmother Naba said softly. And now that your father is gone, the curse has passed to you. A heavy silence settled over the room. Kai wanted to deny it, to laugh off the old woman's words as nonsense. But deep down, a part of him knew there was truth in what she said. He had felt it the moment he stepped foot in the village, the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond his sight. The Skinwalker is coming for you, Grandmother Naba whispered. And you must be ready. Kai stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. No, this can't be happening. Grandmother Naba rose as well, her expression grim. You have your father's journal. The answers you seek are in there. But be warned, the path ahead is dangerous. If you're not careful, the curse will consume you just as it did your father. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the house, leaving Kai stunned. As the door closed behind her, Kai looked back at the journal on the table. The weight of his family's past pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He had left this place to escape the past, but now it seemed the past had followed him, waiting for the right moment to strike. And it had found him. The night was darker than usual. The darkness seemed to press in on Kai from all sides as he sat at his father's desk, the journal open before him. The words Grandmother Naba had spoken earlier echoed in his mind, intertwining with his father's cryptic notes. A skinwalker, tied to his family? It was too much. It couldn't be real. But then, why did the shadows feel so heavy tonight? Outside, the wind howled, a low, mournful sound that rattled the windows. Kai rubbed his temples and closed the journal, his eyes tired from staring at the pages. The house creaked around him, old wood shifting in the breeze, but every sound felt sharper and louder. He tried to shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. Standing up, Kai moved toward the window, peering into the vast desert. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the landscape in an eerie twilight. The mountains loomed in the distance, jagged and foreboding, like silent witnesses to something they would never reveal. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Kai froze. At first, he thought it was just the wind rustling through the brush, but then he saw it again, a shadow low to the ground, moving swiftly along the ridge. He squinted, his heart pounding in his chest. There was something out there. Something watching him. Kai backed away from the window, his breath quickening. He shook his head, trying to convince himself it was his mind playing tricks on him. He had been reading about skinwalkers all day, of course, he was seeing things. But as he turned away from the window, a faint sound stopped him. Scratching. Faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the front door. Kai's pulse quickened as he moved cautiously toward the door, every step making the sound grow louder. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle. For a moment, he hesitated. What was he expecting? Was someone, or something, on the other side? He twisted the knob and pulled the door open, but there was no one there. Just the empty night and the wind sweeping across the barren land. He stepped outside, his bare feet hitting the cold dirt as he looked around. The scratching had stopped, but the air felt wrong, thick with an unseen tension. Then, in the distance, he saw it again, the shadow, watching from the ridge. This time, it didn't move. It stood there, still and silent, its form barely visible against the darkened landscape. Kai's heart hammered in his chest as he squinted, trying to determine what it was. Was it an animal? A person? His father's words returned to him in a rush. It watches me now, waiting. Panic surged through him. He slammed the door shut and locked it, his breathing ragged. He stood in the hallway for a moment, his back pressed against the door, trying to steady himself. His mind raced. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was out there, and if what Grandmother Naba had said was true, it was after him. He needed answers. Kai rushed back to the desk and opened the journal again, flipping through the pages with frantic hands. His father had to have known more. There had to be something, some way to fight this thing. He scanned entry after entry, looking for any clue to help him. His father had written so much about rituals and Navajo beliefs, but nothing made sense to him. None of it seemed real. But then, toward the end of the journal, Kai found a passage that stopped him cold. The Skinwalker feeds on fear. It thrives in the darkness, waiting for the mind to break. But it can be fought. The old ways are the key, the rituals, the protections. If it comes for me, I will be ready. His father had believed there was a way to stop it. But what were these old ways? Kai needed to learn more. He needed to understand the rituals his father had mentioned. He had no idea how to perform Navajo ceremonies or how to defend against something like this. But there was someone who did, Grandmother Naba. Without wasting any time, Kai grabbed his jacket and slipped out the door. The cold night air bit his skin as he hurried through the village. Most houses were dark, and their occupants had been asleep for a long time, but Kai didn't care. He needed answers, and he needed them now. As he reached Grandmother Naba's house, he knocked urgently on the door, his breath forming clouds in the night air. There was no response for a moment, and he worried she might be asleep. But then the door creaked open, and the old woman appeared, her sharp eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Kai," she said, her voice calm but knowing. "I was expecting you." He blinked. "You were?" She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "The darkness has begun to stir. I knew you'd come once you felt its presence." Kai stepped inside, his mind still reeling from the night's events. He glanced around the room, noticing the various tribal artifacts and symbols that lined the walls, dreamcatchers, carved figures, and other sacred items he didn't recognize. The air in the house was thick with the scent of burning sage, a calming but strange smell that seemed to settle his nerves if only a little. "I saw it," Kai blurted out. "The shadow. It was watching me." Grandmother Naba nodded slowly, moving toward a small fire that burned in the hearth. "The Skinwalker is drawn to you now, just as it was drawn to your father. It feeds on fear, on the unknown." Kai ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. "But how do I stop it? My father wrote about rituals, about fighting it with the old ways, but I don't know what that means. I don't know what to do." Grandmother Naba motioned for him to sit, her expression thoughtful. "Your father studied the ancient protections, the ways our people have used for centuries to guard against dark spirits. But to understand them, you must understand the power of belief. The Skinwalker's strength lies in its ability to manipulate fear, to twist reality. But our ancestors knew how to protect themselves." Kai leaned forward, desperate for answers. "So, what do I need to do?" The old woman took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "There is a ritual that can weaken the Skinwalker's power. It is dangerous, but it will allow you to defend yourself. You will need certain items, sacred herbs, feathers, and stones. I will help you gather them." Kai nodded, his fear slowly transforming into resolve. He didn't fully understand what he was getting into, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't let this thing destroy him like it had destroyed his father. As Grandmother Naba began explaining the steps of the ritual, Kai couldn't shake the feeling that the Skinwalker was already watching, waiting for its moment to strike. But this time, he would be ready. Kai stood at the edge of the village, staring out into the endless desert that stretched toward the mountains. His mind raced, trying to absorb everything Grandmother Naba had told him the night before. He was connected to the Skinwalker, his family's bloodline was cursed. He could feel the weight of that revelation pressing down on him like a heavy stone. He had always felt like there was something different about his family, an unspoken tension that lingered in the background of his childhood. His father had always been distant, consumed by things Kai never understood. Now, it all made sense. The curse wasn't just a story. It was real, and it was coming for him. The sun began rising, casting a faint orange glow across the horizon. The village was still quiet, the world seemingly at peace, but Kai couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was waiting just beyond the edge of the light. He glanced down at the small pouch grandmother Naba had given him. Inside were the sacred herbs and stones she had spoken of, the items necessary to perform the protection ritual. He hadn't slept at all, his mind too busy replaying the past few days' events, but he knew what needed to be done. He had to find a way to break the curse and stop the Skinwalker before it was too late. As he walked back toward the house, he spotted a familiar figure standing by the old corral near the edge of the village. Lena, a childhood friend he hadn't seen in years, was leaning against the fence, watching the sunrise. She hadn't been at the funeral, but Kai had run into her the day before when gathering supplies. She was one of the few people who didn't shy away from talking to him, even after hearing about the strange things happening in the village. "Kai," she called out, waving him over. "You look like you haven't slept in days." Kai forced a smile as he approached. "I haven't. A lot is going on." Lena raised an eyebrow, her expression concerned. "I've heard the rumors. People are saying something dark is happening in the village. Some even say it's a Skinwalker." Kai hesitated, then nodded. "It's not just a rumor. I've seen it." Lena's eyes widened, and she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're serious, aren't you?" Kai took a deep breath. "Yeah, it's real. My father knew about it, and it's tied to my family. There's a curse, something passed down through the generations." Lena's expression softened with sympathy. "I've heard stories like that. My grandmother used to talk about curses and witchcraft, but I never really believed it. Not until now." Kai glanced back toward the house, the journal still fresh in his mind. "I don't know how to stop it, but Grandmother Naba is helping me. There's a ritual I need to perform, something that will give me a chance to fight back." Lena looked him in the eye, her voice steady. "You don't have to do this alone, Kai. I know some of the old ways. My grandmother taught me a few things before she passed. I can help." Kai blinked, surprised by her offer. "I didn't know you were into that stuff." She smiled faintly. "I didn't think I'd need to be. But if your statement is true, we're all in danger. And I don't want to sit by and do nothing while something like this is out there." Kai nodded, grateful for her support. "I could use the help. I'm still trying to figure all of this out." Lena placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure it out together." As they returned to the house, Kai couldn't shake the growing dread that clung to him. The closer they got to uncovering the truth, the more it felt like the Skinwalker was watching, waiting for them to make a mistake. Inside, they sat at the kitchen table, the journal open between them. Kai showed Lena the passages his father had written about the family curse and the Skinwalker's connection to their bloodline. Lena studied the pages, her brow furrowed in thought. "This is deep," she muttered. "Your ancestor, he was a powerful medicine man but wanted more. He performed forbidden rituals, thinking he could gain control over the spirits. But instead, he opened the door to something dark." Kai nodded. "My father wrote that the curse passes through blood. Each generation is vulnerable to the Skinwalker." Lena looked up, her eyes severe. "That's why it's after you. It's not just targeting the village, it's targeting you, specifically." Kai felt a cold chill run down his spine. "What can we do?" Lena tapped the journal. "The protection ritual is a good start, but it won't be enough. We need to find the source of the curse, where your ancestor performed the ritual that unleashed the Skinwalker." Kai's stomach turned. "How do we find that?" Lena flipped to a page with a map of the surrounding area. "Your father marked a few locations here. These are sacred sites, places where rituals were performed in the past. One of these might be where it all began." Kai stared at the map, a sinking feeling settling in his gut. He had passed these places dozens of times as a kid, never realizing their significance. Now, one of them held the key to breaking the curse that had haunted his family for generations. "We need to go there," Lena said. "But we have to be careful. The Skinwalker will know what we're up to." Kai nodded, a sense of resolve washing over him. "I don't care what it takes. I'm not going to let this thing win. They gathered their supplies, herbs, feathers, stones, and the journal, and prepared to set out for the first site marked on the map. The sun was higher now, but the air felt heavy as if the land was bracing for what was to come. As they stepped outside, Kai paused, glancing around the village. Everything looked so normal, so peaceful, but he knew better. The Skinwalker was out there, watching, waiting for its moment to strike. But this time, Kai wasn't going to run. He was ready to face whatever came next, no matter the cost. The path to the sacred site seemed to stretch on endlessly. Kai and Lena navigated the desert landscape, their footsteps stirring up clouds of red dust as they ascended the rocky trail. The sun, high in the sky, did little to dispel the chill that clung to Kai's skin. The weight of what they were about to face was palpable, each step bringing them closer to a looming darkness. Lena walked beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon, always alert. The map from Kai's father's journal had led them to the base of a jagged cliff where ancient Navajo markings were etched into the stone. Kai felt a strange sense of familiarity as they approached the site. He had passed this area many times as a child, never realizing its significance. Now, it seemed like the heart of everything, the source of his family's curse. This is the place, Lena said quietly, pointing to the symbols on the rocks. These markings, they're meant to ward off evil spirits. But they're old, too old. The protections are weak now. Kai nodded, his throat tight. My father knew. He wrote that this was where it all started, where my ancestor performed the ritual that brought the Skinwalker into our world. Lena glanced at him, her expression solemn. We have to be careful. The Skinwalker knows we're here. It'll try to stop us. Kai swallowed hard, the reality of the situation sinking in. The Skinwalker wasn't just some distant threat anymore. It was here, watching them, waiting for the moment to strike. He felt it in the air, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, as if unseen eyes were following their every move. They reached the entrance to a narrow canyon, the rock walls rising steeply on either side, casting long shadows that darkened the path ahead. The canyon felt like a natural trap, and Kai couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking right into the Skinwalker's lair. Lena knelt, taking the pouch of sacred herbs from her bag. We need to perform the protection ritual before we go any further. It'll give us some defense but won't last long. Kai watched as she carefully sprinkled the herbs in a circle around them, murmuring words in Navajo that he didn't fully understand. The air seemed to shift, growing still and heavy as if the desert was holding its breath. Lena finished the ritual and stood, handing Kai a small stone carved with symbols. This is for you, she said. It's a protective talisman. Keep it close. Kai took the stone, his fingers brushing over the ancient carvings. A faint warmth radiating from it was a small comfort in the face of what they were about to do. Are you ready? Lena asked, her voice steady but tense. Kai nodded, gripping the talisman tightly. As ready as I'll ever be. They moved deeper into the canyon, the shadows closing in around them. The silence was oppressive, broken only by their footsteps crunching against the gravel. Every step felt heavier than the last, the Skinwalker's presence pressing down on them. As they rounded a bend in the canyon, Lena suddenly stopped, holding up a hand to signal Kai to be still. She crouched down, examining something on the ground. Kai leaned in to see what she had found, footprints. Large, misshapen footprints, too big to belong to any animal he knew of. The tracks were fresh. It's close, Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. Kai's heart pounded in his chest. He scanned the canyon walls, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for any sign of movement. But the Skinwalker was elusive, blending into the darkness like a predator stalking its prey. They pressed on, each step slower than the last, their senses heightened, their breaths shallow. The canyon seemed to stretch forever, the walls narrowing, the air growing colder. Kai could now feel the Skinwalker's presence, a tangible force lurking just out of sight. Suddenly, Lena grabbed his arm, her eyes wide. Do you hear that? Kai strained his ears, and then he heard a faint whispering sound, like the rustling of dry leaves in the wind. But there was no wind, and the whisper wasn't natural. It was coming from the shadows, growing louder, closer. Run! Lena shouted, grabbing Kai's hand and pulling him forward. They sprinted down the canyon, the whispering sound rising into a cacophony of low and guttural voices surrounding them on all sides. Kai's heart raced as they stumbled over rocks, the sound of the Skinwalker's footsteps pounding behind them. He could feel it now, its presence closing in, the air thick with its malevolent energy. They rounded a corner, and suddenly, the canyon opened up into a wide clearing. In the center stood a large stone altar, ancient and weathered, covered in the same Navajo markings they had seen earlier. This was the place, the site of the original ritual, the heart of the curse. "We have to perform the ritual now," Lena shouted, pulling the pouch of herbs from her bag again. The ritual involved creating a protective circle with the sacred herbs, invoking the spirits of the ancestors, and offering a blood sacrifice on the stone altar. Kai nodded, his hands shaking as he helped her prepare the sacred circle. The whispers were deafening now, the air vibrating with the Skinwalker's rage. He could feel it closing in, a shadow looming just beyond the edge of the clearing. "Hurry," Lena urged, her voice trembling with fear. Kai took the small knife Lena had given him and made a shallow cut on his palm, letting a few drops of blood fall onto the stone altar. He could feel the energy of the place, ancient and powerful, pulsing beneath his feet. The Skinwalker was near now, so close he could almost feel its breath on his neck. All of a sudden, a shrill, inhuman scream tore through the air. Kai spun around just in time to see a figure emerging from the shadows, a tall, twisted shape, half human, half animal, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. It was the Skinwalker, a sight that sent a shiver of terror down his spine. It lunged at them, moving with unnatural speed, its claws outstretched. Kai grabbed Lena's arm and pulled her behind him, holding the talisman in front of him as a shield. The Skinwalker recoiled, hissing in fury as the light from the talisman seemed to burn its flesh. "Finish the ritual," Kai shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. Lena quickly sprinkled the last of the herbs onto the altar, chanting the final words of the ritual. The ground beneath them shook, and a bright light erupted from the altar, sending the Skinwalker staggering back. Kai felt the weight of the curse lift, the oppressive darkness retreating as the light from the altar grew brighter. The Skinwalker screeched in agony, its twisted form writhing as it struggled to stay in this world. Then, with one final scream, it vanished, dissolving into the shadows like smoke in the wind. Kai collapsed to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Lena knelt beside him, her face pale but relieved. "We did it," she whispered, her voice shaking with exhaustion. "We stopped it." But as Kai stared at the now empty canyon, a cold realization settled over him. They hadn't destroyed the Skinwalker. They had only banished it. For now. The desert was eerily silent as Kai and Lena returned to the village. The wind had died down, and even the usual sounds of animals and distant movements seemed to have vanished. It was as though the land was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. Kai's heart was still racing from the close encounter with the Skinwalker. His hands trembled from the adrenaline, and every shadow seemed to conceal a lurking danger. He clutched the talisman Lena had given him, drawing comfort from its warmth, but the knowledge that they had only banished the creature gnawed at his thoughts, adding to the urgency of their situation. As they neared the village, Lena broke the silence. "We bought ourselves some time, but that thing will come back." "It always does." Kai nodded, staring ahead. "I know. My father knew that, too. That's why he didn't stop after the first ritual." Lena shot him a glance. "What do you mean?" Kai swallowed hard, his mind still reeling from the weight of his father's journal and everything he had uncovered. "There's another ritual. A final one. One that can destroy the Skinwalker permanently." Lena's eyes widened, and she stopped walking, turning to face him. "A final ritual? You didn't mention that before." Kai took a deep breath, recalling the last pages of his father's journal. His father had been close to performing the ritual, but something had stopped him. "It's dangerous. It's more dangerous than anything we've done so far. It requires a sacrifice," he emphasized, his voice tinged with fear. Lena's face hardened. "What kind of sacrifice?" Kai hesitated. "Blood." Lena's expression darkened as the meaning of his words sank in. "Whose blood, Kai?" He closed his eyes momentarily, forcing himself to confront the truth. "Mine." Lena took a step back, her voice rising with alarm. "No, there has to be another way. You can't just—" "There isn't," Kai interrupted, his voice firm. "I've been over the journal 100 times. My father was right. The curse is tied to our bloodline, the one who first unleashed the Skinwalker." The only way to break the curse is to use blood from that same line, my blood. His words carried a sense of resignation and acceptance of the inevitable sacrifice. Lena shook her head, panic creeping into her voice. That's insane. You'll die. Kai looked away, his jaw clenched. Maybe, but if I don't do this, the Skinwalker will keep coming. It'll never stop, and it'll kill everyone in the village if it has to. Lena was silent for a moment, her eyes wide with disbelief. Then she spoke quietly, her voice barely a whisper. There has to be another way. Kai turned back to her, his eyes tired and resolute. There isn't. My father knew this. That's why he tried to prepare. But he couldn't go through with it. He couldn't bring himself to make the sacrifice. Lena stared at him, her emotions warring on her face. Finally, she stepped closer, her voice trembling with anger and fear. And you can? Kai's throat tightened, and for a moment, he didn't know how to answer. But deep down, he knew what had to be done. The weight of the decision was heavy on his shoulders, and the thought of the sacrifice made his heart ache. If it means ending this curse, yes. The silence between them stretched, heavy with the weight of the decision. Finally, Lena sighed, her shoulders sagging in defeat. When do we do this? Kai looked out toward the mountains in the distance, their jagged peaks illuminated by the fading light of the setting sun. Tonight, before the Skinwalker regains its strength, he said, his voice filled with a sense of urgency and determination. Night had fallen by the time they reached the ancient ceremonial site, the same place where they had banished the Skinwalker earlier that day. The wind had picked up again, howling through the canyon and carrying the scent of sage and dust. The sky was cloudless, the stars shining brightly overhead, but Kai lost sight of their beauty as he prepared for what was to come. The moon cast an eerie glow over the canyon, adding to the sense of foreboding that hung in the air. Lena worked quickly, setting up the altar and laying out the sacred herbs, stones, and feathers they had gathered. Her hands moved with practiced precision, but Kai could see the tension in her movements, the fear etched into her expression. She hadn't said much since they had left the village, and Kai understood why. There was nothing left to say. As Kai approached the altar, he took one last look around the canyon, where his ancestor had first summoned the Skinwalker. It was a cursed place, heavy with the weight of centuries-old magic and blood. And tonight, it would witness the end of that curse. Lena stood by the altar, her voice shaky as she handed him the ceremonial knife. Are you sure about this? Kai nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. I'm sure. The knife felt cold in his hand, its blade gleaming in the moonlight. He knew what he had to do, but the thought of it still made his stomach churn. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, and positioned himself in front of the altar. Lena began chanting the ancient words, her voice rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence that echoed through the canyon. The air around them seemed to thicken, charged with a strange energy that made Kai's skin prickle. He could feel the Skinwalker's presence growing stronger, a dark shadow lurking just beyond the edge of the circle they had drawn. Kai raised the knife, trembling slightly as he pressed the blade against his palm. The sharp sting of the cut sent a jolt of pain through his body, but he didn't stop. He let the blood drip onto the altar, the crimson droplets glowing faintly in the moonlight. Lena's chanting grew louder and more urgent as the ground beneath them began to shake. The air crackled with energy, and Kai felt a cold gust of wind whip through the canyon. He glanced up and saw it, the Skinwalker, emerging from the shadows, its twisted form even more terrifying than before. It howled a high-pitched, otherworldly sound that sent chills down Kai's spine. The creature lunged toward them, but it couldn't enter the circle. The protection held, for now. Kai closed his eyes, focusing on the ritual, the words Lena chanted, and the blood flowing from his palm. He could feel the curse tightening around him, binding itself to his very soul. The Skinwalker screeched again, thrashing against the invisible barrier, but it couldn't touch him. Not yet. The final words of the ritual echoed through the canyon, and Kai knew what would come next. He tightened his grip on the knife, raised it high, and brought it down toward his chest. But before the blade could pierce his skin, Lena screamed. No. Kai froze, his heart racing as he looked at her. Her eyes were wide with terror, but she wasn't looking at him, she was staring at something behind him. Slowly, Kai turned, his breath catching in his throat. Standing at the circle's edge was a figure he hadn't seen in years, his brother. Ethan? Kai whispered, his voice trembling. Ethan's face was twisted in anguish. his eyes glowing with the same sickly yellow light as the Skinwalker's. "I tried to stop it, Kai," Ethan said, his voice hollow and broken. "But it's too late." Kai's blood turned to ice. You're the Skinwalker?" Ethan nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I could control it, but the curse, it consumed me." Kai's mind reeled, his heart pounding in his chest. His brother, the one he had thought was dead for years, had become the very thing he was trying to destroy. "I tried to break the curse," Ethan continued, his voice barely audible. "But I failed. And now it's your turn." Kai stared at his brother, the knife still clutched in his hand. His world spun as the truth crashed down around him. The curse wasn't just about his bloodline, it was about his family. And now, he had a choice to make. He could complete the ritual, end the curse, and destroy the Skinwalker. Or he could save his brother. The canyon was deathly silent after Ethan's revelation, the stillness only broken by the faint rustle of wind through the jagged rocks. Kai stood frozen, the weight of the ceremonial knife still in his hand, but the shock of seeing his brother, alive and consumed by the Skinwalker's curse, held him paralyzed. Lena stood beside him, her face pale as she processed what had happened. Ethan's glowing yellow eyes, filled with anguish, stared back at Kai, and the sorrow in his voice was unmistakable. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Ethan said, his voice barely whispering. "I thought I could break the curse. I tried to stop it before it took me, but it was too strong." Kai took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Ethan, why didn't you tell me? Why did you disappear all those years ago?" "I couldn't face you," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "I couldn't bring this curse to you. I thought if I stayed away, I could protect you, protect everyone. But the Skinwalker, it's tied to us, Kai. It's in our blood. I couldn't escape it." Kai's grip on the knife tightened as he glanced at Lena. Her eyes were wide with fear, and an understanding mirrored his own. This was the moment his father had feared, when the curse had to be confronted, one way or another. The Skinwalker's twisted form lurked in the shadows just beyond Ethan, its glowing eyes watching them intently. Kai realized it was waiting for him to make his choice. "I'm sorry, Kai," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "I couldn't break the curse. But you can. You're stronger than me." Kai shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "No, Ethan. I can't lose you again. There has to be another way." "There isn't," Ethan whispered. "The ritual, it requires a sacrifice. You know that. I tried to find another way, but there wasn't one. It's you or me. It's always been that way." Kai's chest ached with the weight of his brother's words. His mind raced, grasping for any alternative to avoid the terrible choice before him. He could see the pain in Ethan's eyes, the guilt, the torment. But he could also see the truth. The curse had to end. Ethan took a step closer, his glowing eyes flickering with emotion. "You have to do it, Kai. It's the only way. Finish the ritual. Break the curse." Kai's hands trembled as he raised the knife, his breath catching in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, refuse, and find another path. But deep down, he knew there was no other way. His father had tried and failed. Ethan had tried and failed. The curse would continue, passing through their bloodline, unless he stopped it, here, now. "I'm sorry," Kai whispered, his voice breaking. With one final glance at Ethan, Kai stepped forward, crossing the invisible barrier that had separated them for so long. He could feel the Skinwalker's presence, a cold, dark force pressing in on him, urging him to complete the ritual. Ethan nodded, his eyes filled with understanding and acceptance. Kai raised the knife, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, and in a swift motion, he plunged it into his brother's heart. Ethan gasped, his body shuddering as the knife found its mark. Kai's hands shook as he held his brother close, his breath ragged with grief. Time seemed to stand still for a moment, the air thick with sorrow and the finality of what had just happened. Ethan's glowing eyes flickered, the light fading as he whispered his final words. "Thank you, Kai." And then, Ethan was gone. Kai collapsed to his knees, cradling his brother's lifeless body in his arms. The tears he had been holding back finally broke free, falling silently as the weight of his sacrifice washed over him. Lena knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder, but she didn't speak. There were no words for what had just happened. As the blood from Ethan's wound soaked into the ground, a strange sensation rippled through the air. The dark presence of the Skinwalker, The curse that had plagued their family for generations seemed to shudder as though it, too, felt the end of its power. The twisted form lurking in the shadows let out a low, guttural hiss before slowly dissolving into the darkness, its glowing eyes extinguished. The curse was broken. The silence that followed was deafening. The wind had stopped, and the desert canyon seemed to exhale as if relieved of a burden it had carried for far too long. Kai's chest heaved with the weight of his grief, but beneath it, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected: peace. "It's over," Lena whispered, her voice filled with quiet awe. "You did it, Kai. The curse is gone." Kai looked up at her, his eyes red with tears. "At what cost?" Lena's gaze was filled with sorrow but also with deep respect. "Your brother's sacrifice wasn't in vain. He wanted you to break the curse, and you did. He's free now. You're both free." Kai's breath hitched as he slowly stood, his legs shaky from exhaustion and emotion. He looked down at Ethan's body, his heart aching with loss, but he knew Lena was right. Ethan had found peace in the end, and so had Kai. Together, they carried Ethan's body back to the village, the weight of the night still heavy in the air. The village elders gathered in silence as they laid Ethan to rest, honoring him for his role in breaking the curse. Kai stood by the grave, his mind swirling with memories of his brother, the childhood they had shared, and the man Ethan had become. In the days that followed, the village slowly returned to normal, and the shadow of the Skinwalker's curse finally lifted. Kai knew the scars of what had happened would stay with him forever, but he also knew that his family's legacy had been reclaimed. The bloodline that had once been cursed was now free. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the desert in a soft, golden light, Kai stood at the edge of the canyon where it had all ended. The wind was gentle, carrying with it the scent of sage and the faint sound of the village in the distance. For the first time in years, Kai felt a sense of peace. He closed his eyes and whispered a silent prayer for his brother, his father, and all those who had suffered under the curse. The past was behind him now, but their memory would always remain. Kai turned away as the wind swept through the canyon, leaving the darkness behind. Thanks for watching. If you want to see other scary stories, then like and subscribe.